So the purpose of this chat is to discuss delegated proof of stake as it relates to EOS.io and block production and security. Some of the new features in Byzantine fault-tolerant DPoS, BFT DPoS, which we are introducing with delegated proof of stake in EOS. So I'm going to assume there's very little knowledge about how delegated proof of stake works or what even Byzantine fault tolerance is. So I'll start by defining the goal. The goal is to decentralize power, make sure that there is no censorship over the inclusion of transactions into blocks, as well as to make sure that everyone agrees on the same order of events. Once you agree on the order of events and you've prevented censorship, then it's just a matter of applying your deterministic state machine to arrive at the consensus state. So there's several characteristics that we're looking for in our consensus algorithms, and that is what the latency is until the first confirmation, and then what the final latency is until it's irreversible, until you know with certainty that there's no going back, everybody agrees. So Byzantine fault tolerance is the idea of you being certain that everyone else is certain that you all agree on the same thing. And that if there is any disagreements, like two different groups think that everybody else is on a different point, that would be a Byzantine failure, where half the generals attack and half of them don't, and therefore the battle is lost. So you would say it's Byzantine fault tolerant if you can generate cryptographic proof of who the Byzantine generals are if you get in that state. The goal is to make sure that the goal of Byzantine fault tolerance is to ensure that if two different groups reach the conclusion that everyone else is thinking something different, or you have basically two different consensus states, that's a Byzantine failure. And in order for that to happen, there should be cryptographic evidence of who the parties are at fault. And that's Byzantine fault tolerance. And if you have that cryptographic evidence, then you can utilize various systems for penalizing the parties involved. You can cause them to forfeit their bond. You can exclude them from the community. There's all kinds of measures. You can remove them from the current set of block producers. All right, we have a Byzantine fault, you're no longer a block producer. And that sort of forces everyone to behave and to cooperate with the consensus, because if they don't cooperate with reaching consensus, then there's evidence of wrongdoing. So I'm going to start with delegated proof of stake, the traditional way that BitShares and Steem do it. And I'm going to ignore the election process. For now, we're just assume that there's a set of 20-some block producers who have been elected. And once they're elected, they take turns producing blocks. So we've got this blockchain, and I'm going to use Steem and BitShares for starters, and then I'll get into how EOS.io does it differently. Every 3 seconds, a block producer is scheduled to produce a block. There's only one block producer who can produce a block at that time. And on Steem and BitShares, every round, which is all 21 block producers, we shuffle them. So it might be ABC this round, and then the next round it might be BCA, and so on as time goes. If something happens, you could end up with the situation, say B's node goes down. In that case, there's basically a gap. You don't have any block at that point in time. So that's just a regular failure, but there's many reasons it could go down. The other thing that could happen is B could build off of C, but his block doesn't propagate to the next producer in time, and so the next producer also builds off of C, and then the third producer afterward, they kind of break the tie. So the rule of DPoS is the longest chain is the consensus chain. And the reason we can say that is if you got 21 producers, there's a rate of growth, which is based on how many producers are on that chain. So if you have all the producers, you have max speed. It's growing at 1 block every 3 seconds. If you only have half the producers, you're growing at half speed. So that chain's going to be shorter because it's not growing as fast. And so by using the longest chain rule, it works kind of like Bitcoin. You know where the consensus is because that's where the majority of the parties are. And that rule works even if you have some kind of massive network split that divides you up into 4 different subchains. One of them is going to be the longest. And the rule is that if you're on a node, and so let's say you're on this chain here, and you receive another block that builds off of here, you don't switch to this because these two are the same length. The next block comes in. At this point, this chain's longer. You switch away from this fork and you switch over here. All right, and so this is DPoS. This is the longest chain rule, and that's the eventually consistent model. This system will work even if only one block producer is operational, one honest one, because that one honest one can support the election that changes the set of producers that elects the new producers until you eventually get back to full speed, which is a nice property to have because it means the network can continue. With Steam, we introduced a concept called the last irreversible block. And that is the block that 2/3 of the other producers have built on top of. So I've got block B, and once I know that B's been built on by C and A, I now have 2 out of 3. I can say that I'm never going to be able to go back beyond here. So even if there's another fork that comes off of here and it's longer, my node won't switch to it because I've already had 2/3 consensus, and the only way that that's even possible is if there's some kind of bad behavior going on. So this protects all the nodes against those types of malicious behavior. They kind of stay with the first thing that they saw the consensus on. And as long as 2/3 are honest, you're never ever going to have this event happen anyway.
Dan, what type of attack is that trying to solve?
That solves a lot of the long-range attacks, where someone gets old keys that used to be used and then creates an alternative blockchain. It basically helps everyone agree on what the current chain is, and if I already have agreement, there's no point in me going back. It's a clear sign of attack. It does not solve the new node starting up problem. But any new node starting up, they have to download the software from somewhere. When they download that software, they're implicitly trusting that single server to tell them what software, what checkpoints, and everything else. And there's lots of other ways that we can verify that you're on the proper chain when you're syncing. But the way we're planning things for EOS, the vast majority of users won't be downloading a new chain. They'll be using service providers, kind of like Steemit, web wallets, and the like. And they'll be synced at all times. And so they'll have a recent block, and they'll have peers that they know that they trust to sync with. And they're run by experts. You can verify that they're on the proper chain. But generally speaking, those forks won't even be created because they require 2/3 of the block producers, past or present, to collude to attempt to make that happen. In reality, if you have 99% participation, which is the participation rate Steam and BitShares enjoy, even if 2/3 of the old producers do collude, they won't be able to create a chain that's longer than the real chain, which is operating at a faster speed. They'll just never catch up. So DPoS in this mode is very secure. With last irreversible block, it sort of gives us a threshold beyond which we don't have to maintain rollback or undo states, so it helps with efficiency. So on Steam and BitShares, the pending state, which is every block after the last irreversible block, could be 45 seconds on average. That's how long it takes to get 14 out of 21 block producers. And this time impacts inter-blockchain communication. So now that we've gone over regular DPoS, I'd like to talk about Byzantine fault-tolerant DPoS, as well as how we're reducing latency to half-second blocks. And I'll talk about reducing latency to half-second blocks here first, and then I'll get into the BFT. So we've got nodes located around the globe. And if this is the US and this is China, this round trip time could be 300 milliseconds. And then you throw in the size of the block and the bandwidth constraints over longer connections. That's impacting the latency. So when you've got block A and block B, or rather that way, the block produced by A has to be received by B before their time slot. If it's not received and validated by B in time, B's going to ignore it. And then you're going to get forking and loss of participation. The whole network starts to collapse. So in Steam and bit shares, it's random. So sometimes we'll go this way, then we'll go this way. You just don't know which way you're going to be going in terms of that. So the entire system is designed around this worst case 300 millisecond round trip. And that's assuming they're directly connected. If they're indirectly connected, you might have 2 hops and latencies add up. Because the latency includes both the network latency to get there, the processing time on the node, because nodes don't relay blocks that aren't valid, and then on to the next node. This is why Steam and BitShares have a 3-second block time, because 3 seconds has produced a stable network that allows for all this propagation delays. You can tell by these times that it seems like half a second is probably impossible. How in the world can you do half a second when it takes half a second to go to China and back? Well, first thing, if you look at the clock, now you got 1 block every 3 seconds. Right? So if node A produces a block at this time, they're including all the transactions it received over this window in time. So what we do is we say, well, what happens if we have A, and A? Then we hand off, and now we have B, and B. This is every 500 milliseconds. But there's absolutely 0 latency here. So you're never going to miss any blocks from here. The handoff from here is the only time you actually have to worry about internet latency. What's the worst case that happens? Well, maybe this block and this block get orphaned, or maybe it's the other way, maybe one of these. You might lose a few blocks in the handoff, but you can adjust the ratio of blocks per node versus handoff frequency so that your total downtime is less. And even then, this downtime, time without any confirmation, is less than the 3 seconds that you have with Steam and BitShares before you get your first confirmation. The other thing we do on EOS is we recognize that these block producers are generally going to be very well known, like exchanges, universities, maybe small governments, elected individuals with high amounts of trust. So we don't really have to worry about them misbehaving overtly. And we know where they're located. We know who they are. So we can connect them with direct connections to each other, and the producers can coordinate amongst themselves to select the order that they go round robin, such that you have California, Virginia, Greenland, China, India, around the globe, where it's basically 80 milliseconds per hop, rather than 300 milliseconds, which means that you have far fewer missed gaps in between here. So we're removing the random shuffle that you would see in Steem and BitShares. The purpose of the random shuffle was to prevent A or block producer B from always skipping A, or vice versa. It kind of prevented one block producer from picking on another block producer. But here it'd be very obvious. C goes down because this guy's always missing him. Well, there's going to be a dispute. We have a dispute resolution process. We can figure out who to blame. All the other peers will say, hey, I saw the block produced, but they didn't include it. What's going on? And then the voters can figure out how to resolve the issue. So because these are well known, they're incentivized to cooperate or they're going to lose votes. If there's a lot of fighting, we don't know who's at fault, we just vote them all out, right? So we get this very, very stable, low latency connection that still goes around the world and distributes it. So this is still censorship resistant because you still have 21 different jurisdictions, 21 different people that are subject to both votes and arbitration. Because someone who's overtly censoring legitimate transactions is actually violating their constitution.
Yeah, we've heard recently about transactions as proof of stake. Were mentioned TAPOS. Can you please describe that?
Sure, I can talk about that here. Transactions or proof of stake is literally every single transaction included in a block. So if you've got a block here, it's got all these transactions. These transactions have a hash that references a previous block. And those transactions can only be included in a blockchain that has the previous block, which means it can't be migrated to forks. It also means that every user is also indirectly confirming the blockchain. So you can take the stakes of all the users, and depending on how active they are, you have direct confirmation. Like block producers are kind of indirect confirmation. People vote for them and then the block producers confirm. But when users are interacting, you know where all the users are. Every transaction is a vote in the consensus. The problem is it takes longer time frame because you can't get every user to vote every block. But you can get every user to participate maybe every day. On Steem, I think like 50% of the stake participates within 24 hours, which is far, far better confirmation of the blockchain than anything you could get from bonding or betting or Casper-like protocols.
Is this a big part of interoperability between blockchains?
Tapos does not play a part in that. It protects the user from having their transaction replayed on a different blockchain. The user is basically saying, this is state of the world I saw when I signed this transaction. And if any of my assumptions are wrong, then this transaction is not valid. So if someone presented a false chain, and then I made a transaction based on that false chain, it couldn't be included in the real chain. So it protects the user, and just adds to the overall integrity with very, very little overhead. So Steem, BitShares, and EOS all support this pretty much the same way. So we talked about, this is how we reduce block times to half a second. This is how we reduce latencies by controlling the order. And we did sacrifice some of the attack resistance measures of Steem and BitShares, where we assume that maybe the block producers are a little bit more hostile than they are. But the reality of DPoS is the harm that they can do is only censorship. They can't unilaterally change rules. And any bad behavior is observable, and there's means of resolving it. So in order to get the higher performance, which we think will benefit the end users more than the theoretical situations where one block producer will pick on another block producer. One of the main differences between proof of work and DPoS is DPoS incentivizes cooperation. All producers are paid the same thing regardless of the transactions they include. So there's no saying, hey, I'm going to ignore your block so I can get this transaction with a high fee. There's no, I'm going to produce more blocks so I can make more. They all get paid for producing a block, and there's no financial incentive to attempt to manipulate block production. And there's financial disincentive for bad actors because they get voted out. But even with this system in place, it still takes 45 seconds to get irreversible, because I might have 12 blocks produced by A, but I need to wait until I've got at least one block produced by 2/3 of the producers, and it still takes 45 seconds to get 2/3 of the producers. So what we do is a block is produced by A, and then as soon as all the other producers receive it, if it extends their blockchain, basically it's a new high watermark in length for them, then you're going to get acts from B, C, D, E, and F all immediately. Right? And so A might produce several blocks, and with a little bit of time delay, basically you've got your producers around the world. A produces a block, it propagates out to all of them. Once you got 2/3 back from all of them, it's irreversible. So you say go to China and back. Right? Maybe that's 1 second, you've got irreversibility because that's the worst case. So with 1 second delay, we've got irreversible Byzantine fault-tolerant confirmation. Now, how do we know that it's Byzantine fault-tolerant? Well, the rule is no producer can produce a block at the same block number. I don't know if you can see that. So you've got the same number, and you've got the same time. So every block header, you've got its number and its time and the previous block, and the producer who signs it, and you have that information there. So if a block producer only signs a block when they receive a new high watermark, that's going to be a sequence number. If they sign, in order to produce a fork, they have to sign that 2 different blocks at that sequence number, which is proof of Byzantine behavior. So if you have a chain here, I'm going to erase this. I've got a chain, and A produces a block, and then B produces a block, and then C produces a block. If I want to create an alternative chain, well, I need to have another block produced by B and another block produced by C. Now I've got 2 chains at the same length, and in theory, I guess produced by A again. According to the last irreversible block rule, this might be one irreversible block, this might be another irreversible block, and now you've got Byzantine failure. But in order for this to happen, C had to assign 2 blocks with the same block number or the same timestamp. And A had to do it. And you had to have at least 2/3 of the producers be Byzantine in order to create an alternative irreversible block and break Byzantine fault tolerance. And even if only one is, you can detect Byzantine failure of a single node, which means that if you present that evidence, and all the evidence is 2 block headers signed by the same person with the same block number, or 2 block headers signed by the same person with the same time, because remember, we have the time slots, and there's exactly one producer who can produce a block at that time. And on all forks, there's only one producer who can produce a block at that time. So 2 block headers signed by the same, 2 different block headers signed by the same person at the same time or block number is proof of Byzantine failure. It requires 2/3 of them to create an alternative last irreversible block, and you've got evidence. And when you submit that evidence, you can do all kinds of things for your smart contracts, everything from automatically removing them from the producer set to seizing their bond if on their behavior or their state tokens. And this is far, far, far better than the other Byzantine algorithms on the market, because normally, if you take something like Tendermint, Tendermint says you've got 1 block. This is the head block. It goes through some process, and then you got another block. And every single block is irreversible. And this process in the middle involves communicating to all the parties, initial proposal, then you have your pre-vote, everyone says this is what I think I saw, and then you have your follow-up commit vote, this is what everyone told me they thought they saw, and then you finally get your commit. And this entire process takes 2 to 3 seconds on a good quality network that's global. So a Tendermint blockchain will reach irreversibility, but you'd only have one block every 2 to 3 seconds. And if 1/3 of them fail, all block production stops. The blockchain is dead. Whereas DPoS, if all but one fail, the chain can continue until you elect new, and then you can continue operation. Furthermore, this entire system can fail if 1/3 is Byzantine, whereas BFT DPoS requires 2/3 to be Byzantine in order to actually reach a false irreversible consensus. And then the metrics of determining who's at fault is a little bit more complicated here than it is on DPoS. So there's a lot more communication because all parties have to communicate with all parties, I think at least twice, maybe 3 times. Whereas DPoS, one person broadcasts it, everyone else responds, and you're done for confirmation, and you don't need to do all the other handshakes. So those things combined create Byzantine fault-tolerant DPoS with 500 millisecond block times, irreversibility after maybe 1 second, and continuous operation as long as you have at least one honest node, and it requires 2/3 failure instead of 1/3 failure.
Then, as an end user or as a DApp developer, what does that mean for me?
All right, so reducing the confirmation latency from 45 seconds to 1 second dramatically improves communication between blockchains, because one blockchain can't accept a message from another blockchain until it's irreversible. So instead of me sending that blockchain a message, it waiting 45 seconds, processing the message, then sending me a message, waiting 45 seconds, so now you're talking like a 1.5-minute round trip communication between blockchains. With this system in place, now you have 1 second, maybe 2 seconds round trip between blockchains, which is faster than 3-second confirmations on BitShares today, or Steem today. The other benefit you get as an end user is from the time you take an action to you get your first confirmation, it could be less than, on average, 250 milliseconds. You do it, it gets received and confirmed at the next 500 millisecond mark. You know with 99.9% probability that it's going to be eventually irreversible in that very short time frame, which means all the interfaces can be a lot more responsive to the user. Because latency, on Steam you click upvote, it goes 1, 2, done. Now you click upvote, done. So it will allow seamless user experiences.